Hi, welcome to Junior Historians. I'm Darcy, the middle school librarian at the St. Charles Public Library. Today, Dr. Steve is going to be sharing with us the Greek revival homes of St. Charles, which is a beautiful example right here. Steve, what can you share about what this beautiful architecture for this?
Well, it's one of the first revivals of ancient architecture from the Greek and Roman classical styles, and many of the early Greek temples were built on hillsides. And this is an example of a house on a hillside. Actually, this is the west bluff of the Fox River, and so this is a fine example of what early Greek revival would look like, built in 1859 by the mayor of St. Charles. His name was Dr. James Lewis. He was a physician, medical doctor who practiced until 1892. Dr. Lewis served as the first mayor of the city of St. Charles in 1875. And he had been living in this house. And one of the prominent things of all Greek revivals is the pediment, which makes up the triangle space of the roof. The roof is a low-lying, low-pitched roof. It's supported by columns. It's very typical of Greek temples. And then along the bottom edge of the roof, you'll notice there's a wide band of trim. That's called the frieze board. All Greek revivals have wide frieze boards, and they're applied differently on different buildings, and we'll show you a different example after we film the Lewis house. So below the pediment is the frieze, and the frieze is supported by 4 columns. These are of the classical style. They are actually Doric and Ionic or Corinthian columns, and those are the styles of the Roman and Greek columns. Another typical thing of Greek revival is that the windows are usually divided into small window panes, and those are called lights. So our windows here are multi-light windows. There's 6 multi-lights per sash. So we would call this 6 lights over 6 lights. Each window unit is made up of 12 small window panes. And that's very typical of the Greek revival. Another thing, Greek revivals are very symmetrical. They're very well balanced, equal distance to the left and right of the center line. In this example, we'll notice that off to the side of the main gable, we have what we call an L. That's a secondary portion of the property, of the building, and then there's some additions that were added to the house later on in its history. But what we would call, this is a fine example of a Greek revival gable front. Oh, another thing is, because of its age, this building has a limestone foundation, and it's made with wood siding known as clapboard. So its construction is stone and wood. And that's about it for Dr. Lewis's house.
All right, let's move on to the next house.
Sure.
We're at our second location. Dr. Steve, what can you tell us about this house?
Well, we're at 515 West Walnut Street, and this is known as the Elisha Freeman house. It was built about 1853. It's another example of Greek revival. It's constructed with limestone foundation, limestone sills and lintels over the windows, and it's also fabricated with locally made brick from one of the St. Charles brickyards.
That's
Now,
cool.
Elijah Freeman was the owner and operator of the first drugstore on the west side of St. Charles, which opened in 1838. He was director and president of the St. Charles Branch Railroad in the 1850s. He built and opened the first bank on the west side of St. Charles in 1855. And one of his last accomplishments, he was one of the first directors of School District 8. And he started the first public school in St. Charles in 1854. Now, Mr. Elijah Freeman built this Greek revival. Was a popular style of architecture in the 1850s in the United States. Now, this is an example of a gable front, a Greek revival, and the roof makes the pediment, which is a triangle shape, However, the base of the triangle is missing. So we don't call this a full pediment, it's called a broken pediment. There is no horizontal connection between the two ends of the building or of the roof eaves. Now, immediately below the roof eaves, you'll notice there's some square-shaped boxes of wood. That is the frieze. In the prior building, we noticed the frieze extended across the entire front of the gable of the building. In this case, we notice the frieze is only underneath the roof eaves and extends along the eaves to the side elevations of the building. And you can see them where the building extends to the left and the right. Again, a very dominant feature of Greek Revival. There are no columns on this house. This house was a simpler style of Greek Revival, but in lieu of columns, they had a fancy entryway. The front door entrance has a roof. It's called the entablature, and supporting the entablature are pilasters. So they look like columns, except they're connected to the wall of the building. And if we notice the entry door is a wood panel door, but on each side and above it is surrounded by small windows. The side windows are known as side lights, and the window over the doorway is called the transom. That was a very typical element of Greek Revival. And last but not least, we have multi-divided lights. Small window panes make up each window sash, and we'll notice it's a 6/6 window sash pattern of multi-lights. And we'll notice that is common in almost every Greek Revival house that's in St. Charles that still sports some of its original architecture.
Now we're over on the east side of the river. Dr. Steve, what can you tell us about this structure?
Well, we're at the same time period as the other two buildings. We're in the 1850s. Actually, this house was built in 1854 by Joel Hubbard. And it was in 1857, it was sold to George Fearson. And Fearson and his brothers were one of the large early families in St. Charles and were involved in much of the progress and development of the city. This is a designated landmark by the city of St. Charles, and it also is listed on the National Register of Historic Places by the federal government. Joel Hubbard was a contractor, carpenter, mason, and was known to have been working with his neighbor, and we'll talk about his neighbor's house shortly. And he was only here for a short time and moved on. And George Fearson's family owned this property into the 1960s, his descendants. So it was held by a family for well over 100 years. George Fearson was a public servant. He held multiple civic positions with the city of St. Charles. He had two brothers, Reed and Dean Fearson. They were early developers of the city and township of St. Charles. And as I mentioned, his descendants owned the property until 1963. I had to get the date. So architecturally, this is what we call a gable front. The additions on the house are subservient to the main gable, but the gable front pediment is broken again. The triangle does not have a base. It does not cross along the bottom edge of the triangle, so it's called a broken pediment. And in its place, we have a broken frieze panels. The wide trim boards that are underneath the eaves of the building are called friezes, and you'll notice there's only, what we can see from this view are two small squares or rectangles. Now, the window pattern is the 6/6 multi-light window pattern, typical of Greek Revival. One of the most important things about this house, in fact, the fanciest component of architecture, is the main entrance. The front entrance has a pilaster on each side and entablature across the top, which makes the roof. And it has a main entry door, which is wood paneled, and it has surrounding windows, two side lights and a transom window over the top. This is very typical of Greek Revival. This structure is made out of wood. It's wood framed with wood siding. It has a limestone foundation, very typical of the Midwest. And that's it for George Fearson's house.
Yeah, let's head on next door.
Okay.
All right, now we've moved next door, and this is our final house of the day.
This is the Andrew Weitzel house. It was built in 1853. We're on the east bluff of the Fox River. To your rear is the Fox River down a hill. Again, Greek revivals tended to mimic Greek temples, and they loved building these structures on hillsides. Now, Andrew Weitzel House was designated as a local city landmark, and it's also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Weitzel was a mason who reportedly worked for William Beath, another contractor mason in St. Charles in the 1850s. The architecture of the house is simple, what I would call a gable front, simple Greek revival. And again, we have the roof makes a triangle-shaped pediment, but the base of the triangle is broken. So we have a broken pediment, and the frieze panels are immediately underneath the broken pediment portions of the roof. They do extend along the sides of the house and rear of the house, but from this view, you're unable to see it. Another classical example of the Greek revival is the symmetrical front facade, the 6/6 multi-light windows, and the very fancy, elaborate entry door. And again, the entry door, there has no columns, but it does have pilasters supporting the entablature across the top, which makes up the roof. The door is a wood frame door, and it's surrounded by side lights and transom windows. Fine example of Greek revival. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Steve, for introducing us to the Greek revival style and telling us about all the different elements that go into this architectural style. And that's it for Junior Historians.